This episode of BiCurean, Eric and I spoke with Tara Galeano. In addition to learning more about her new book, Rediscovering My Body, Tara shared about what inspired her to become a sex therapist and taught me the phrase erotic sovereignty.
Hi, I'm Eric,
And I'm Aisla.
and together we are the hosts of the BiCurean podcast.
BiCurean is our answer to the polarizing culture we live in.
Tired of feeling under siege and looking for ways to get involved? Then come be a part of a different way of thinking.
Everything from politics to geek culture to current events that polarize us as a society, we explore multiple ways of looking at things. Welcome to the show.
Hello, everyone. Hopefully you've had a good week. We certainly have been busy.
Been doing things. We're going to say it vaguely, though. We've been doing things.
So this week's show, we
Yes.
decided to invite back a guest that we had on. It was towards the beginning of COVID, I recall, that we had that discussion and stuff, which is both feels like a long time ago and is also still a current event. So
It was one of our special episodes.
Yes, I believe so. Yeah. So but this week we have Tara Galeano back with us. Tara, just in case there's people who are hearing this show for the first time and you for the first time, why don't you tell us about yourself?
Sure. My name is Tara Galeano, and I'm a certified sex therapist and now author, in addition to a speaker and a retreat host. And I help women get their sexy back. I help them rediscover their bodies in ways that reconnect to their sensual selves. That's the big work that I'm bringing forth in this world at this time.
That has to be rewarding, and I can imagine there's a lot of interesting challenges that you face in that. And before we get into the juiciness of your book and all of that, I have a question for you that I'm hoping I'll just ask and then we'll see how we'll go from there. Does that sound right? Is that?
Yes.
Okay. So how would you define BiCurean?
I love that. And so simply, I what comes to me is both and. So the exploration of two ends of the continuum, and then also the reconciliation of those, and through discussion, through curiosity, through dialogue.
Ooh, I like that one. That's basically a different way of phrasing what we came up with the idea for the show. So
I have to say I'm having a lot of fun asking this question. I do feel like everybody else does a much better job of it than
yeah, at this point, we're probably just gonna have to pick the ones we like and start using them as our catchphrases. So
I love it.
So
That's a great question, though. Yeah, I love that. Thank you.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
So, when we had you back on back in the day, we talked a lot about essentially the things that lead women to you. So again, just in the interest of kind of recapping some of that stuff, I think maybe it's a good spot to start. Like, what led you to pursue women's sexual health and freedom?
Yeah, and that's a great question. And I would say that professionally, I didn't set out to be a sex therapist. I probably didn't even know what one was when I was a child. And I studied to become a therapist, and everybody started talking to me about sex and sexuality. And there was a paucity of information and education in my academic career. And I didn't have a class on human sexuality in my graduate studies. And so then it was all about catching up. And personally, I felt like I knew something, but professionally, I didn't know much. And now that I know so much more decades later, what I'm finding is that there's really been a shift in how I'm working with people. So there was much more of a professional facade as a therapist, and that I really needed to hold that role to engage in a therapeutic relationship. And now kind of I'm disrupting that because I want to show up as my authentic self so I can reconnect with myself and reconnect with women in a way that's real and meaningful and authentic. Because I think that then we're able to have a much richer conversation. And women want that. They want to know how to be more in their feminine self and allow things to happen as opposed to pushing to make things happen in a much more masculine way. And so this connection to themselves in a sensual way is, I feel like it's changing paradigms. It's changing the way that we're going to do government. I feel like it's the way it's the way of the future. I feel like this is profound, but it begins with each woman claiming her own erotic sovereignty and being an agent of change in her own life to know what is true for her.
I have never heard that term before, and I love it. Erotic sovereignty and an agent of change in my own life. Like that brings up just a lot of feelings. I can't even say their thoughts yet. And this, like, aha.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and I'll say, from the point of view of myself, cis, male, gendered, I think a lot of men don't necessarily understand what it's like to not be sexually free. The funny part is that I think that there are plenty of men who are not, or are operating in such base animalistic ways around it and not really understanding it. But I mean, even just in the relationships that I've had, I've enjoyed when I've had a partner that wanted to explore that sort of thing. So I have a way of connecting to what this all is, even from a male gendered place of I guess the way that I would phrase it is that there's just seems to be a lot of stigma that women deal with. And the first thing to do is to get over the stigma. So.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I mean, and I would say that shame is often embedded in our body on a cellular level. So it is the personal shame or trauma that we experience, it's ancestral. And then there's also the cultural exchange of that within our body. And that causes such, I would say, fragmentation for women that they can't even access what is true for them. So they imagine that they know what is true within their body, and they're not quite even clear if it is. There's a distortion.
Yeah.
So being able to trust and know the sensations in their body are true is, I would say, revolutionary. Because when we tap into that and are able to be with that, then it not only leads us to know ourselves more completely, but it allows us to show up with more coherency, and then also leads to this opportunity for erotic sovereignty. It's like without even knowing that, then we're externally referencing. We're thinking that I'm sure about what it is that's true because somebody else has validated me.
Yeah. And one of the things that I know inspired me to ask you to come and be on the show again, both to talk about your book and what you're up to, is you have this tagline, and I'm going to read it. So the name of the book is Rediscovering My Body, and the sentence, I'm calling it a tagline, is learn to fortify your soul through the physical replenishment of sexual connection with yourself and others. And that just really struck me growing up as I did in a very conservative and Christian community, and then America, where we do not frequently bring together the concept of our soul or our spirituality and our physical pleasure, our sexual expression. And as I have worked to develop myself as an adult, I have found to bring them together. It is a very fulfilling experience, and it's just not where I started. And I'm sure there's more to be done around that. And so I was very inspired by that connection. And I think it's a very powerful place to stand in this conversation.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I absolutely agree. And I think that you said that very well. That is, kind of that's the air that I breathe. So I'm glad that you're pointing to that, because I wouldn't have named that myself. And I do see that sex and soul are somewhat interchangeable, because I believe that when we're in our fullest expression of sexual ecstasy, of sexual pleasure, that it is a soulful experience. And my understanding as I'm working with more and more women is that there's this overlay of religious dogma that inhibits and constricts women's sexual expression and breeds shame. um, Goodness, and it's really disastrous in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
So to that point, and you brought this up a little bit earlier, and my brain's been spinning on it since. So I kind of want to come back to this idea that you said that people kind of have a cellular level of shame, and it popped into my head that you see 2-year-olds and 3-year-olds that will run around naked all the time,
Yeah.
right? And at some point, though, I think, and it almost is probably, especially for women, you need to cover up. It's inappropriate. And I think that, in my mind, that's where it triggered for me. It's like, I thought that's kind of where I felt like shame started, and depending on how maybe puritanical your upbringing was, maybe that had an effect. So I just wanted to throw that random thought that I was having and get your thoughts on it.
Yeah. And I would say yes. Yes. And there also might be an imprint that we have that we're carrying on a cellular level from our ancestors of shame, of being sexual, that shows up for us. So then the external environment reinforces what is already in our DNA. And so one of the conversations that I'm having with women recently is about this ability to fully show up and the fear around that. And it's not fear of failure. It's more fear of success and being seen because of this fear of annihilation. So if they are to fully show up in all their glory and in who they are, that there's this fear that they would be completely and utterly annihilated. Now, is that true for them in this lifetime? Most of them probably not. And yet, when we look at the history of women, that, we were burnt at the stake for being witches or for having knowledge that was not deemed appropriate or didn't fit into the structures that be. So I know, and from my own work too, that there is this ancestral connection that informs us. And so one of those encoding patterns that happens is one around shame. That's not the only one. I mean, I feel like there's so much more on a personal level. My ancestors, I'm a Colombian American, and I have a very strong connection to my Colombian ancestors, that they have done a lot of work for me to be here. And I don't have that fear of annihilation that I can relate to with my other sisters, because there's an urgency. I feel like there's such an urgency to get this message out there that it goes beyond the fear of annihilation, because we need to know as women that we absolutely can tap into this power of knowing ourselves through being more embodied.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, it makes sense. I was just trying to reconcile this idea, like I said, that there's definitely, and it happens for boys too. We're told you can't run around without pants on anymore, at an age. And then suddenly, I think it coincides with hormones kicking in as you're growing up, right? Because now all of a sudden you want to take your clothes off for a different reason. So, but yeah, it's just interesting to me, and I love the whole concept of a priori knowledge and things like that, and the things that are imprinted on us like animals. I mean, cats gravitate towards using a litter box. It's programmed. I wouldn't know what to do with a cat if it didn't come that way, right? So, that's and I think that does happen with humans as well. So it's always interesting to see when people who study this stuff on a regular basis kind of come up with what some of that a priori knowledge might be.
Yes, I love that. Yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
And one of the things that I've talked about with Eric, I don't know, is that, when I was raising my children, I had a female-bodied and a male-bodied human. And so I did a lot of reading. And so it was interesting, around right before middle school, I was reading books on identity and sexual development and emotional expression. And it was just so evident to me, because all of the books that I read around girls in our culture were about the ways in which they weren't allowed to be angry. and how, you know, that they had all emotions except anger, and
Yes.
then and boys had uh only anger and lust. I would say, you know, we don't talk about it as a emotion, but it's kind of there. Girls are of course not allowed to have that either. And it and then over time, just like reading more about developmental things, and you know, and how to support my children in being whole beings, right? Like, because you actually need all of them. You can't having
Yeah.
just one or two. But like to Eric's point, that you know, many men would not perceive themselves as you know, not sexually free, and yet for a lot of men the only ways that they are allowed to touch people is either in anger or sexual desire. So
Yes.
their sexual desire is fostered or encouraged and manipulated by the media. However, it is also one of their few, and I do think this is changing, so I don't want to create that as the truth of today, but I think it has and continues to be one of the few ways in which men can touch another person without being shamed for it culturally, right? Like they might have their own experience of it not feeling okay, but they can hit them or they can sexually, you know, want them. and
Mm-hmm.
and so I think that like it feels like a freedom because you can do a thing, and yet it's also there's an inhibition around the emotional experience or the connect. I mean, I think not being a man, maybe you should talk to that. But
Well, no, I mean it's true. Like there is that dichotomy, and women don't have it. Women can be affectionate with each other and with men, and it doesn't have to be sexual. But men
Yeah.
don't. Men just in general culturally don't have that.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. Yeah. I remember being very conscious of this, particularly when my children were growing up, and part of their education was dance instruction. And what I loved about that is that the young men then had this opportunity in a non-sexual way to be in a very intimate physical connection with young women. And so my son was able to swing dance, salsa dance with young women. And what I love about that is that it's such an art and such a way to be able to control the energy and be able to lead and allow someone to follow in a very intimate setting. And so it disrupts this notion of aggression and sexuality and builds this beautiful bridge of how then can you create beauty with this, I don't know, hormone overdrive.
and that's you brought that up, and I was thinking, what other kind of co-ed activities would there even be that might involve some physical contact? And there's not a lot.
There's not a lot. Yeah. But that was one of the beautiful ways. And I think in this culture in particular, it doesn't live as much. But when I think about other cultures like Latin American cultures, there is that fluidity, there is that rhythm, there is that movement, and it's intergenerational, which is beautiful.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, we could spend the rest of the show talking about the difference between most cultures and American culture as
Yes.
it exists. We're still puritanical, and it causes us more problems than anything else.
Yeah, I mean, and how it's intensified with coronavirus. My son lives alone, and he doesn't have anybody that he touches on a regular basis, except when he goes to see his sister and his niece. And so then there's a physical contact. But this, I would say, this lack of touch, this, the way that the U.S. culture has held coronavirus is different from other cultures where they've endorsed people to have a buddy, where they have somebody that they can touch. It's very, very strange how we've approached this.
Well, and because we haven't encouraged it in a healthy way, the ways that I've seen,
Yeah.
not naming any names, but some of my friends react to it, and they almost go so all in risky ways,
Yeah.
and a
Yeah.
coronavirus world, like the first step is having the safer sex talk, except for it's about the safer exposure talk from COVID, and people will skip that, right?
Yes.
And maybe they'll get to the safer sex talk later if that's where they're going to end up going with a potential partner or whatever. But they're so desperate just to have that partnership that they're just like, I'm clean, you're clean, let's go. I don't have
Yes.
COVID, you don't have COVID, right? Good, let's do this.
Yeah. So it's this all or nothing attitude, this black or white, which is so, goodness, American. And the opportunity, especially with my book, Rediscovering Body, it is slowing things down. It's like when we take things at a slower rate and we don't let everything overcome us, that we're able to manage things more effectively. And we're able to really feel the sensations and notice what feels pleasurable. But I think that oftentimes we're in this hyper mode where we're speeding things up and wanting more is better, and instant gratification. And it's the inverse that will actually serve us, because then we're allowing things to emerge in their natural rhythm and time.
Yeah, and that makes sense. So short of reading off the back of your book, maybe you can touch on kind of what it's about, what inspired it, and give us a little cliff notes. What's your elevator pitch?
Yeah, what's my elevator pitch? Well, today,
Mhm.
the way that I'm working with it is that, oftentimes people, especially in my field, as like a sex therapist, they write their first book for their peers, kind of to establish themselves an expert. And I thought, oh, I so don't want to even play that game. I want this book to be a practical guide that bypasses the cerebral, because it goes right into the body. So it's so practical, it's very direct. There's exercises and activities, there's spaces to draw in it and to write. It's really this glorified journal that's very beautiful. I wanted to make it a sensual experience, from the quality of the paper, from the ink on the page, from the illustrations, from the way that it looks. And so I wanted it literally to embody that beauty that I want women to, goodness, embrace within their own life.
I'm in.
Yeah, cool. Me too.
And I like that too, because I've bought plenty of books and they definitely can get really cerebral. But the best self-help, any book that I've ever seen that does not approach it that way. It's much more of an interactive process. So even the fact that you called it, like a workbook kind of a thing is inspiring in that regard.
Yeah, I really wanted women to know that they are the expert on them, and that it's not me. And these are just prompts and exercises and activities to help them get closer to understanding the data points of who they are.
That's awesome. And I think it's helpful to go back to that concept of like sex and soul, and that my own personal journey around learning how to bring them together when they were so separated. I think for me personally, anytime I can get past my thinking brain, my analytical gets in my way, gets caught up in all sorts of things, thinking brain, and get into simply engaging with the situation, being led through a practical exercise and taken down to simply doing an action. I'm much more likely to make a shift when that is what's happening, as opposed to, I can talk theory all day. I love it. And I found sadly over the years that to a certain extent, talking theory can be a way to avoid allowing a change while pretending that I'm interested, because I'm afraid, right? Like there's that part of me that's afraid.
Your honesty. Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
And so, so I'm glad to hear that, because I find that can be such a great opportunity for me. And I think there's a lot of folks who can really appreciate the opportunity to not have to read about it, not have to talk, and also like to not have to talk about it. Sometimes it's hard to talk about it. Say, all right, I'm going to do this exercise and see how that feels.
Mm-hmm.
Because it is our body that's having the experience. So knowing how it feels is part of what we need to get connected to.
I love it. Absolutely. Yeah. And yeah, absolutely. I 100% agree. And as a talk therapist, I know that talking is so highly overrated.
Well, I think there's few things than sexuality that can be more fun from a practical application standpoint.
There's that.
There's that, yes.
I mean, we're not talking about dieting. Practical applications never as much fun.
Yes, that's true, yeah. Yeah, it's really not the essential experience. And I think that it's important that it comes from within, because I think when we put the overlay on it that I should, like kind of with the dieting, I should be doing this, or I'm putting a rule on this, like I need to do this every day, then it becomes problematic, because then it's not allowing what lives in us to be. And that's the encouragement that I'm offering to women, is like, discover what's true for you. So this book for me was based on my version and memory of Be Here Now. So it's kind of like an odd shape. It's got the artwork. It's not the spiral writing, but we did the best that we could with the text that we had and the way that we could do it. But really wanting women to use their bodies as a vehicle to being in the present moment, which connects the soul, which connects the spirit, and also our sensual nature. Because I feel like as women, we are sensual beings, and the more that we embrace that and don't try to be so much in our masculine energy, which is, I would say, driven and a little bit more goal focused, that we allow things to happen, that a huge unfolding or shift can happen for us as women and in our lives.
So that brings up another thing that kind of just popped into my head that I'd love to hear your thoughts on, because I think something that's a consistent thing, I guess we've talked to just in my everyday experience, one thing that I definitely see, and it applies to men in different ways, but there is this pressure for women to be things and men to be things. I mean,
Yeah.
how do you see that reconciling in the sexual way? I know for a fact that, you know, I've heard many stories from women that feel like they have to be sexual in a certain way, or
Yeah.
responsive in a certain way, or you know, in a lot of regards, even not responsive in a certain way.
Yeah.
So, you know, just curious, like how you see that, because again, you know, it's hard to talk about this stuff without my brain going to the social and cultural pressures that just kind of come with our society.
Yes. Yes. And what I love about those is that those, when we truly know our own felt sense about things, our own truth about things, those then can become choices and not dictates, and not the default. And so, for example, if I'm having an erotic experience and I know what brings me pleasure, then I can completely own that and be able to identify and articulate that to my partner or partners or whoever I want to express that. And if I know what it is that they're seeking, I can make that choice to play a certain role. But then I know that it's a choice and it's not just the unconscious default mechanism, because I don't know of any other way. And so there's no right or wrong. It's just really bringing the consciousness of claiming, again, your erotic sovereignty.
Yeah, I think that's so valuable. I've definitely had conversations with peers, my own process around exactly what you're talking about. The difference between being in relationship and expressing yourself as a feeling of like this is just how it has to be versus having gone through a process to understand who you are and how you are and how you relate in this scenario. The same exact activity could have a completely different feeling.
We can often get stuck in the storyline where that becomes so real, and then we're not feeling into our sensations. And then it's so powerful to speak our truth.
Mm-hmm.
And that's not easy. We don't live in a sex positive culture. And so to have fluency of vocabulary, of words that actually form what it is that we're trying to express, and to have that comfort or confidence in trying to express that can be really difficult, because it creates a lot of intimacy to be able to say, this is what pleases me. This brings me pleasure. And from my experience as a therapist at the university, oftentimes young people would have drunken hookups so they could bypass that, because they didn't want to have that conversation, because that creates more intimacy, to have those words, to know somebody's names, to say, this is my pleasure, and I would like for you to give that to me. That's huge.
Well, that's an interesting concept. So, do you think that in a lot of ways hookups are driven by people actually being more in touch with their sexual beings?
I would say in the drunken hookups that I have heard about from young people, that it was a disembodied experience and that it was not empowering. and that it was this opportunity to have sensual gratification without the ability to really own their own pleasure. So there was a bypassing. Is that the way all hookups need to be? No, I don't believe. I don't believe that's true. But that's certainly what was happening in these incidences with these young people, because they didn't have the skill set to be able to say what it is that was really powerful to them. They didn't have that. They'd never practiced that before. They didn't have role models. But to be able to say that, that's a lot of maturity.
Yeah, it's very vulnerable. Are
Very vulnerable.
are you familiar with the Our Whole Lives curriculum? It's a program done by the Unitarian Universalist Church, and I want to say the United Church of Christ, and they do it in 7th grade. And
Oh, yes.
and
Yes.
it's one of the most well done programs because it's co-ed, and the students have to talk about these things with each other, and so they have 7th graders doing things, they expressing, they start with like values, like what are your values and how do you express them. They make them role play different things, and I can see in the adult children that I know that attended it that they have a very different kind of confidence in how to engage with themselves and with other people around what they feel comfortable with. And
I
so
love it.
yeah, it's a beautiful program. I'm very impressed with it. It was put together I want to say in the 70s, and I still think it's very relevant, and it's, because it's church based, it's quite affordable.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I love that. Thank you for mentioning that. No, I do have a friend who said her son did that recently in the past 2 years, and how powerful it was for them and for their family, because then it ripples out and it impacts the community, and that's a beautiful thing.
Right. Well, and when I was working in Washington State several years ago, they were working with Sweden because the Swedish education program for children is like probably one of the best in the world. And I wanted it to be here, and it's not. And so I found that one. I was like, okay, well, this is the closest thing I can find for youth. It's
Mm-hmm.
much limited, but it's something.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, and I just dream of a world where we can have those conversations with our young people so they feel confident to be able to claim their pleasure. And what happens when young women in particular are able to identify what is pleasurable to them and really claim it, is that issues like sexual assault actually go down. It's like those things are not as relevant. And I may have said this last time, but one of the most horrific things I've ever had to do as a parent was to explain to my daughter what rape is when she was 11, because that was the question. Mom, what is rape? I hear this word and I feel like, God, I want to live in a world where that is not something that I have to describe to anybody ever.
Yeah. No, that's really, it is. It's horrible to have to present that to someone as part of life.
Yeah, I I think there's few things more frightening, and again, this is from discussions I've had with women close to me in my life and other people. Like there's few things that strike more fear into a woman than the idea of when they're not safe, especially in that way. So,
Yeah.
and I would dare to say that I mean I have to assume a lot of your work and this book would probably benefit people that have had that terrible experience in trying to reclaim things, because even if they had a good or reasonably okay impression of some of that sort of thing, rebuilding that if it's taken from you could be horrifying.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And women who have had life-changing experiences like sexual assault, goodness, women who've had chronic illness, cancer, all of these women who are in the process of rediscovering their sensual selves benefit from this process. That's where this work came from. It came from working with women who had had cancer, who were wanting to reconnect to themselves sensually, because what they knew about their body was a sense of betrayal, and then there was grief, and then there was rage. And so we needed to address the trauma that was existing in the body, and I wanted to make sure that there was a strong emphasis on pleasure and building their confidence around their capacity to hold more pleasure in their body.
Yeah, makes sense. I mean, it's a shame that there has to be an industry of sexual therapy and all of that to address all of it, but
Yes. Yeah.
Well, but I'm glad you're doing it.
oh no,
Yeah,
I'm not knocking your work in any way. Thank you
No,
very
no.
much, but you
Okay.
know,
Of course.
it almost makes me feel sad just that that's kind of the world that we've created, and maybe eventually we can get to that point where your book is to help people explore rather than repair damage, you know, from a more fully explorational place.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think that's always the job of a good therapist, is to work themselves out of a job, right?
Yeah, I hear you on that. Well, so what would you like to leave our listeners with? In
Yeah, I always like, you know, a snippet of advice. Somebody's going to buy your book tomorrow, hopefully, but they're having an experience possibly with a partner or something. Like, what's a good practice maybe to take with them?
I just, what comes to me is to really be gentle with themselves. I think oftentimes we should ourselves to death, and that it's really about doing what brings you joy in the moment and just allowing yourself to do that one thing. And maybe tomorrow that looks a little bit different. But I think if we can embrace the idea of maybe doing one thing that brings us more joy that we can feel in our bodies, then we're in a better place than we were the day before. So it's both this commitment of moving forward and holding that aspiration, but also of allowing. Because I think when we make a rule about something and we should something, then it becomes constricting all over again. And I'd say 9 times out of 10, most of us just don't need that.
yeah,
No.
especially around stuff that's supposed to be connective and pleasurable and sensual,
Yeah,
Fun.
fun.
I think knowing what you want, I mean, that's good advice for anything. Like, get an idea of what you might like. You know, that applies to even things outside of sexuality and it's life in general. You know, take a moment and understand. It's good advice.
Yeah, and with that,
So yes, we'll wrap the show up. Thank you for being on. We really appreciated you and the time you gave us. We can definitely look at having you back on. We love having you on. So,
agreed.
and with that, we'll say thanks for listening. If you have ideas, feedback, thoughts, please find us on social media. We are BiCurean on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Or you can give us a call at
303-578-9155 or email podcast@BiCurean.com. And if you like what we are doing, please tell your friends about us or share the episodes you find most interesting.
Thank you.